A story of snow, secrets, and the man nobody saw coming. The temperature was 11 degrees below zero when Ethan Calder saw the tire tracks disappear off the edge of the mountain road. Not slide, not drift, disappear. One moment the marks were there in the fresh snow, clean and deep, the kind left by a heavy vehicle moving fast. The next moment, nothing, just the guardrail, bent outward like something enormous had punched through it, and beyond that a black drop into the dark Colorado mountainside below. He stopped his truck. He didn't want to look. He looked anyway. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button and tap the like so you don't miss a single story. I put everything into these, and your support is what keeps them coming. And when you're done watching, drop a comment below and tell me the city and country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to Ethan, to the wreck, and to the woman who was about to change everything about the life he'd fought so hard to build. The blizzard had started around 2 in the morning, which was fine by Ethan because he hadn't been sleeping anyway. He rarely did anymore. Not well, at least. Not the way normal people sleep, flat on their backs with their chests rising and falling in some peaceful rhythm. Ethan slept the way a man sleeps when his body has been trained for too many years to stay half alert. One ear always open, one part of his brain always running perimeter checks on sounds that shouldn't be there. 7 years since he'd left the teams. And still, he'd gotten up at 4, pulled on his thermals, his Carhartt jacket, his boots, and gone out to check the livestock before the storm got any worse. The forecast had said 8 to 12 inches. The sky was already saying they were lying. His truck was a 2009 Ford F-250, dark green, rust eating at the rear wheel wells, heater that took 10 minutes to do anything useful. He didn't need a better truck. He didn't need much of anything, which was one of the reasons he'd ended up out here in the first place. 23 miles outside of Pine Haven, Colorado, on 40 acres of land that required enough physical work each day that his brain didn't have much room left to circle back to the things he preferred not to think about. The road he took to the nearest feed store cut along a ridge that most locals avoided in winter. It wasn't officially closed, but the county didn't prioritize it for plowing, and if you went off the edge in the wrong spot, the drop was significant, and the cell coverage was non-existent. Ethan had driven it maybe 300 times. He knew every curve, every patch of ice that formed first, every place the wind came sideways and made the truck feel like a sail, which was exactly why the tire tracks stopped him cold. He put the truck in park and sat there for a moment, engine idling, wipers working back and forth across the windshield. The headlights cut about 40 feet into the snow before the dark swallowed everything. He could see the guardrail. He could see the gap where it wasn't anymore. He could see the tracks going straight at that gap, not swerving, not correcting. Going straight at it, hard and deliberate, like the driver had been looking at something else entirely when the road ended, or like something had hit them. Ethan got out of the truck. The cold was the kind that reached through whatever you were wearing and grabbed the bones directly. He pulled his flashlight from the cab, clicked it on, and walked to the edge. The beam dropped down the embankment, steep, rocky, choked with pine trees, and caught the glint of something metallic maybe 40 feet below. A vehicle, dark-colored, on its side. "Hell," he said to nobody. He went back to the truck, pulled out the tow rope, his emergency kit, and a wool blanket that had lived behind the seat for years. He tied one end of the rope to his trailer hitch, looped the other end around his chest in something approximating a harness. Not perfect, not OSHA approved, just functional, and went over the edge. The slope was worse than it looked from above. The snow was deep enough in places that he sank to his thigh, and underneath the snow was a layer of frozen mud that gave way unexpectedly, so every third step became a controlled fall. He grabbed at pine branches, at rocks, at anything. His boots found purchase and lost it again. By the time he reached the vehicle, he'd torn a gash in his left palm on something he couldn't see, and his face was wet with snow and his own breath. The SUV was a Mercedes GLE, probably 3 years old, the kind of vehicle that costs more than Ethan made in 2 years. It had gone off the embankment on the driver's side and rolled, coming to rest on the passenger side against a pair of pine trees that had stopped it from continuing down into the ravine below. The windshield was shattered, but mostly intact. One headlight was somehow still on, pointing uselessly into the slope. Ethan pressed his face to the cracked passenger window and shone the flashlight inside. A woman. She was suspended by her seatbelt, which had locked when the vehicle rolled, leaving her hanging sideways with her head slumped toward the driver's door now below her. Dark hair, cut short. 30s, maybe. She was wearing a wool coat over what looked like business clothes. Not dressed for this mountain, not dressed for this cold. A laptop bag had burst open somewhere in the roll, and papers were scattered across what was now the ceiling, the floor, everywhere. She wasn't moving. Ethan tried the door, jammed. He moved to the windshield, found a corner where the glass had pulled away from the frame, and worked at it with his hands until he had a gap wide enough to squeeze through. He'd done this before. Not this exactly, but close enough that his body knew what to do before his head caught up. He got his shoulders through, then the rest of him, dropped into the interior, and immediately felt the vehicle shift, a slow groan of metal settling against the trees. He froze. The vehicle steadied. He moved again, slower, and got to the woman. Her pulse was there. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck and counted, unsteady but present, maybe 60 beats per minute. She had a laceration above her left eyebrow, already crusting in the cold. Her left wrist had an angle to it that wasn't natural. "Hey," he said. His voice came out rough. He cleared his throat. "Hey, can you hear me?" Nothing. "I'm going to get you out. Don't move." He worked the seatbelt release, braced her with his body so she didn't drop, and lowered her as carefully as the space allowed, which wasn't carefully at all, really, but carefully enough. She made a sound when he moved her, something between a groan and a sharp intake of breath, which he took as good news. You didn't react to pain if you were too far gone. He got her through the windshield gap by going out first and dragging her after him, which was clumsy and probably hurt her and couldn't be helped. Once they were clear of the vehicle, he pulled the blanket from inside his jacket where he'd been keeping it body warm, wrapped it around her, and started up the slope. The tow rope was the only reason he made it. He climbed hand over hand, the woman over his shoulder in something close to a fireman's carry, his feet scrambling for grip in the snow. His palm where he'd cut it burned. His lungs burned worse. Halfway up he stopped, pressed himself against the slope, and breathed for a moment. He'd carried men out of worse places than this. He kept going. When he reached the top and later in the truck's back seat, he stood bent over with his hands on his knees for a full minute before he could do anything else. 43 years old this coming March, and his body was increasingly honest with him about the gap between what it could do and what it used to do without complaint. Then he straightened up, because there was something he'd noticed at the bottom of the embankment and hadn't let himself think about yet. He went back to the edge with his flashlight and directed the beam down at the Mercedes, the tire tracks on the road behind him, the direction they came from, the gap in the guardrail. He walked along the guardrail for 30 feet in either direction, crouching, looking at the road surface where the snow had been disturbed, and found what he'd suspected, a second set of tracks, wider tread, heavier vehicle, that had come up close behind the Mercedes and then veered sharply away right at the point where the Mercedes had gone through. Not an accident, the second vehicle had pushed her off. And then there was the thing he'd seen on the undercarriage of the Mercedes when he was working to extract her, a small device, matte black, about the size of a deck of cards, attached with a magnet below the rear bumper. He'd registered it in the way you register things when you've been trained to notice things that don't belong, and then set it aside because the more immediate problem was the unconscious woman. But he kept thinking about it now. He thought about it all the way back to the truck. He turned the heat up full, checked her breathing again, checked the laceration on her head. She stirred when he touched her forehead, turned her face slightly away from him. Her eyes didn't open. "It's okay," he said. "You're out of the car. I've got you." He pulled out his phone. 1 bar, maybe. He tried emergency services and got a recording. All emergency lines were handling current incidents. Please hold. He tried the county sheriff's non-emergency line, which he had saved because he'd called it twice before about different things entirely, and got through to a dispatcher who told him the highway closures had effectively cut off his section of the ridge for the foreseeable future, and that any emergency services were, at minimum, 6 to 8 hours away. "Is the individual in immediate danger?" the dispatcher asked. Ethan looked in the rear-view mirror at the woman in his back seat. She's got a head wound, possible broken wrist, and she was in 30-degree temperatures for at least 20 minutes. "Sir, we're doing everything we—" "How long for an ambulance?" A pause. "At least 6 to 8 hours, sir. Possibly longer with the current storm conditions. Is there somewhere you can take her that's safe and warm? He ended the call. His ranch house was 12 minutes back the other direction. It wasn't a hospital. It had a wood stove and a generator and a first aid kit that he kept properly stocked because living 23 miles from the nearest town required a certain kind of self-sufficiency. It had a couch and blankets and Mia's pediatric ibuprofen in the bathroom cabinet, which was a slightly different dosage but would have to do. He turned the truck around and drove. Mia was awake when he came through the door, which she wasn't supposed to be at 4:30 in the morning. She was 7, which meant she operated on some internal frequency that woke her whenever the house made unexpected noises, and apparently the truck pulling up and the door opening had qualified. She appeared at the top of the stairs in her pajamas, the ones with the tiny horses on them that she'd been sleeping in for 3 months and refused to retire despite the fact that the cuffs were getting short, holding her stuffed rabbit by one ear. "Dad? Go back to bed, Bug." "Who is that?" She'd seen the woman before he'd even gotten her through the door. Mia had eyes like a hawk and made it her business to notice everything in her immediate environment, which was either an admirable quality or an exhausting one depending on the hour. "She was in a car accident up on the Ridge Road. I need you to go to your room." "Is she dead?" "She is not dead, Mia. Room." "She looks like she might be dead." "She is not dead. She's unconscious. There's a difference. Go to your room. I'll come explain everything when I get her settled." Mia looked at the woman, looked at Ethan, looked at the woman again with an expression of deep and scientific interest. Then she turned and went back up the stairs, taking them one at a time in the unhurried way she did everything. "I'm not sleeping," she said from the top. "I know." He got the woman onto the couch, got the wood stove stoked, got her wet coat off, and 2 blankets on top of her. He cleaned the head wound with antiseptic, which was not the most elegant medical procedure, but was what he had. The laceration wasn't deep enough to need stitches, more than he'd like, less than it could be. The wrist he wrapped and splinted as best he could, using the knowledge that was left over from field medic training, that he hadn't used in years but apparently still lived somewhere in the back of his head. He sat in the chair across from the couch and watched her breathe and drank the coffee he'd made mostly to have something to do with his hands. Around 5:30, she started to come around. It happened the way it usually does. Small movements first. A shift in position. A tightening of the face like something uncomfortable was filtering through. Then her eyes opened, and they were blue, darker than he'd expected, and they moved immediately around the room in the quick, involuntary scan of someone who woke up already assessing for threat. Not the eyes of someone who'd been peacefully sleeping. The eyes of someone who'd been running in their sleep and hadn't stopped yet. She landed on Ethan and went very still. "You're okay," he said. "You were in an accident. I pulled you out of the vehicle. You're at my house." She stared at him. Her jaw was set, lips pressed together, some internal process happening behind her eyes that he couldn't read. "What's your name?" he said. A beat. Then, "Sloane." "Sloane what?" Another beat, longer this time. "Whitaker." He nodded. "I'm Ethan Calder. This is my property. The roads are closed, emergency services aren't available for several hours at minimum. You've got a laceration on your forehead, a splinted wrist, and probably a concussion. Is there anything else I should know about? Allergies, medications, anything that might be relevant?" She was looking at him the way people look at someone when they're trying to quickly figure out whether they can trust them. He recognized the look. He'd worn it himself. "No," she said. "Okay. My phone." She started to push herself up and made a sound that suggested her wrist was weighing in on that decision. "Easy," he said. "Your phone was in the car. I've got the emergency bag that was in the passenger footwell. It came with you when I got you out." Her eyes found the bag immediately, over by the door. "Can I?" "Sit first. You've got a head injury. Give it a minute." She sat. She didn't look happy about it. She looked like a woman who was accustomed to moving at a pace that other people found unreasonable, and lying on a stranger's couch in the middle of a blizzard was not in the schedule. "Someone was following me," she said. He kept his face neutral. "Tell me about that." "On the road. Before the accident. A vehicle came up behind me fast, and then—" She stopped, pressed her fingers to her temple. "Then I was in your living room." "A black SUV," Ethan said. "Larger than yours. Came up behind you and made contact before you went through the guardrail. She looked at him sharply. You saw it? I saw the tracks. 2 sets. Yours and theirs. Theirs veered off right at the guardrail. The room was quiet except for the wood stove and the wind working at the windows. There was also a device, Ethan said, watching her, on the undercarriage of your vehicle. I didn't remove it. The car was too unstable when I noticed it, but it was there. Matte black, about so big. He held up his fingers. Tracking device, most likely. Maybe something else. Sloane Whitaker looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the bag by the door. Then she looked back at him, and something in her face changed. Not much. Not visibly to someone who wasn't paying close attention, but Ethan was paying close attention. And what he saw was the specific look of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just registered that the person across from them might be capable of understanding the weight of it. She didn't say anything else. Not yet. But she was thinking about it. Upstairs, Ethan could hear Mia's small footsteps moving around her room, not sleeping, just like she'd said. The wood stove ticked and settled. Outside, the snow was coming down harder than before, piling against the base of the windows, burying the world under something clean and white and completely indifferent to whatever was happening inside this house. Ethan got up, poured a second cup of coffee, and set it on the table beside the couch. Whenever you're ready, he said. He sat back down and waited. She drank the coffee. That was the first thing. She picked up the mug with her good hand, wrapped her fingers around it, and drank without saying thank you. Not rudely, just automatically, the way someone drinks when they've forgotten that social niceties exist because their brain is occupied with something considerably more urgent. Ethan noticed and didn't mention it, and refilled the mug when she set it down empty. The second thing she did was look at every window in the room. Not casually. Not the way a person glances around an unfamiliar space because they're curious about the decor. She looked at each window in sequence, assessed the view through each one, and only after she'd completed the circuit did she settle back against the couch cushions with something that was almost but not quite relaxation. Ethan had seen that behavior before. He'd performed that behavior before, in rooms on 3 continents, in situations where the wrong window at the wrong moment meant the difference between going home and not going home. He filed it away and said nothing. How far are we from the highway? She asked. 23 miles, but the highway's closed anyway. Storm system came in faster than they predicted. The county road commissioner's automated line says no vehicles until at least midday, and that's if it stops snowing in the next 2 hours. He paused. It's not going to stop in the next 2 hours. Sloane set the mug down on the coffee table. She was sitting up straighter now, and the color had come back into her face, which was a good sign. The laceration above her eyebrow had stopped bleeding and was already starting to close. Her eyes were clearer than they'd been when she first opened them. Still calculating, still moving, but focused now rather than scattered. Your daughter, she said. Is she? She'll stay upstairs. I wasn't worried about that. A pause. I was going to say she sounds like she's moving around a lot up there, for 5 in the morning. She doesn't sleep well either. He said it before he thought about it, and it landed in the room in a way that felt more personal than he'd intended, so he moved past it. She'll be fine. She's used to unexpected things. Sloane looked at him with an expression that suggested she had questions about that statement, but she didn't ask them. I need my bag, she said. He got it for her. She went through it methodically, pulling things out and setting them on the cushion beside her. A tablet in a cracked case, 2 external hard drives, a compact satellite communicator that was a more serious piece of equipment than most civilians owned, and a standard company phone still in its silicone case. She looked at the phone for a moment, then set it face down on the cushion without turning it on. Ethan noticed that too. She powered up the tablet, waited for it to boot, and whatever she saw on the screen made her jaw tighten very slightly before her expression went neutral again. The accident was reported, she said. What? On my company's internal communications system. Someone posted an incident report for a vehicle accident on Ridge Road 7 at, she checked the timestamp, 4:18 this morning. She looked up at him. I went off that road at 4:03. Ethan was quiet for a moment. How long does it usually take for an accident to get logged on your company's internal system? It doesn't, not automatically, not without a police report or an insurance notification, and neither of those has happened yet. She turned the tablet toward him so he could see the screen. A brief incident report, time-stamped 418, logged under her name, listing the route number and describing a single vehicle accident. Someone who already knew what happened filed that, Ethan said. Yes. Someone inside your company. She looked at him steadily. Yes. He sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and was throwing snow against the south-facing windows in irregular bursts, the sound like handfuls of sand being scattered against glass. The wood stove had gotten the front room up to something livable, maybe 68 degrees, though the edges of the house, the corners, the spaces near the floor, still held the cold in the way old structures do. You said someone was following you, Ethan said, before the crash. Yes. Were you expecting that? A long pause. The kind of pause that isn't about thinking, she'd already thought about it, but about deciding. He could see her running some internal calculation, weighing something, and he recognized that too because he'd sat across the table from men who were deciding how much to tell him often enough to know what it looked like from the outside. Not exactly, she said finally. I knew there was a possibility. I didn't know it would happen last night. Why was there a possibility? She picked up the mug again, found it empty, set it back down. Her good hand went to the edge of her splinted wrist and pressed very lightly, not scratching, just touching. The unconscious gesture of someone managing pain they're pretending not to notice. What did you do before this? She asked. Before you had a ranch and a daughter and a truck that sounds like it needs a new muffler. The muffler's fine, it just sounds like that in cold weather. The corner of her mouth moved, almost imperceptibly. Before this, she said again, Navy. Specifically. He held her gaze. SEAL teams, 12 years. She nodded once, as if this had confirmed something she'd already suspected. Then you understand operational security. You understand that some information creates liability, for you and for the people around you. I understand it, he said. I also understand that I pulled you out of a car that someone else put in that ravine, and that same someone just logged a report suggesting they know you survived. Which means the question of whether you tell me what's happening isn't really about your comfort level with disclosure. It's about whether you'd prefer to handle whatever comes next alone. She was quiet. You're at my house, he said. My daughter is upstairs. If someone's coming back to finish what they started, I need to know what I'm dealing with. The fire shifted in the stove. Somewhere upstairs, Mia's footsteps crossed her bedroom floor and then went still. Sloane Whitaker looked at the phone lying face down on the cushion beside her. Then she looked at the satellite communicator. Then she looked at Ethan with an expression that had something unfamiliar in it. Not quite vulnerability, but adjacent to it. The look of a person who has been self-sufficient for so long that asking for help requires a kind of internal recalibration they haven't needed to perform in years. My company, she said, is called Whitaker Integrated Systems. We do cybersecurity, primarily for government contracts, Department of Defense, federal agencies, critical infrastructure protection. Annual revenue is about $800 million. She said the number flatly, without emphasis, the way you'd say any number that had long ago stopped meaning anything to you personally. I founded it 11 years ago. I've had the same chief operating officer for the last 7 of those years. His name is Victor Hale. Ethan said nothing. Let her find her own pace. 6 months ago, I started noticing irregularities in the financial reporting for one of our largest government contracts. The contract is worth about $400 million over 5 years. It involves building and maintaining a secure communications infrastructure for a federal agency that I'm not going to name right now. She looked at him steadily. The irregularities were small at first, rounding errors, essentially, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking carefully. But I was looking carefully because one of my auditors flagged something, and once I started pulling the thread, she stopped, took a breath. Someone had been diverting funds from that contract for approximately 8 months, in small enough amounts, routed through enough layers of sub-accounts and shell contractors that it had been invisible. By the time I found it, the total was somewhere north of $40 million. Ethan let out a slow breath through his nose. Victor Hale, he said, the evidence points there. I can't prove direct authorization yet. Whoever set this up was careful about layering, but the access points were his. The timing correlates with decisions he made. And when I started pulling the financial records, someone inside the company began accessing my personal calendar and communication logs. She paused. I didn't realize that until about 3 weeks ago, when my IT security director found a ghost process running on my executive account. Someone had been watching my schedule, my meetings, my travel plans, including last night. I was traveling to Denver to meet with two federal investigators who'd reached out to me after I sent them a preliminary summary of what I'd found. I told nobody in the company. I booked the drive instead of flying specifically because airport travel creates records that are easy to monitor. The only people who knew my route were... She stopped again. Nobody, Ethan said. I thought nobody. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Someone knew your route well enough to stage a vehicle to intercept you on a mountain road in a blizzard at 4 in the morning. Yes. That's not a crime of opportunity. That's planned. I know. They tracked you. Probably the device on the undercarriage. It would have given them your location in real time. They waited for the right stretch of road. Yes. Her voice was flat, not emotionless. There was something underneath it, a tightness, the sound of someone keeping something controlled that doesn't want to be controlled, but level. She wasn't falling apart. Whatever she wasn't someone who fell apart easily. They filed the incident report before emergency services were notified, Ethan said, thinking aloud now, which means they were monitoring for the accident confirmation. They wanted to know if it worked. And now they know it didn't, because the report exists, which means someone checked, and the check would have shown the scene. No body, no emergency response, just an empty car. And my truck tracks, Ethan said. She looked at him. Going down the embankment and coming back up with 2 sets of footprints, he said. If they went back to the scene to confirm, they'd see that someone pulled you out. The room was quiet for a beat. They'll look for where I went, she said. You're 23 miles off the highway on a private road in a blizzard. There are 3 ranches in this direction and mine is the closest to the scene. If they're methodical, and it sounds like they are, they'll narrow it down. He said it plainly because she was the kind of person who needed plainness right now, not reassurance. Reassurance was for situations where the reassurance was warranted. This wasn't one of them. Sloane was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised him slightly. I'm sorry. He looked at her. You don't know me, she said. You pulled someone out of a car because that's what a decent person does. And now you're sitting in your own living room being told that the people who tried to kill that person might be coming here. She looked at the ceiling briefly, then back at him. I'm sorry for that. I mean it. You didn't ask to be run off a mountain. No, but I should have... She stopped, pressed her lips together. I should have been more careful. I knew the risk was escalating, and I kept thinking I could manage it myself. Why didn't you go to the authorities sooner? I did. I contacted the FBI field office in Denver 6 weeks ago. They opened a preliminary inquiry. A pause. Victor has a relationship with the deputy director in the agency's financial crimes division. I don't know how deep that goes, and until I do, I can't trust that the inquiry isn't being monitored from inside. She shook her head slightly. The 2 investigators I was going to meet last night were specifically recommended to me by a federal judge I trust, outside the normal reporting chain. So you were trying to route around whoever Hale has in his pocket? Yes. Ethan stood up. He went to the window and looked out at the landscape. Nothing visible but dark and snow and the shape of the tree line. The driveway a smooth white suggestion of where the gravel used to be. No headlights? Nothing moving. He stood there for a minute, just looking. He didn't want this. That was the honest thing to sit with. He was 37 years old. He had a 7-year-old daughter who had already lost her mother and had, as a result, developed a relationship with uncertainty that no 7-year-old should have to develop. He had 40 acres of land and livestock that needed feeding and a fence line on the north pasture that had been needing repair since October. He had a life that was small and deliberate and mostly held together, and he had worked extremely hard to build it into something that looked, from a distance, like peace. He did not want a CEO's corporate war showing up at his front door. He turned around. Mia was standing at the bottom of the stairs. She had come down completely silently. She did that sometimes, materialized in doorways the way only children and cats can, without any apparent transition from not there to there. She was still in her pajamas, still holding the rabbit, and she was looking at Sloane Whitaker with the frank, unhurried curiosity of a child who had not yet learned that staring is impolite, or who had learned and found the lesson unconvincing. Are you the lady from the crashed car? She asked. Sloane looked at her. Something in her face shifted. Barely, but it shifted. I am. Dad carried you up a hill. I've been told. He's strong, Mia said, in the tone of someone reporting a well-established fact. But he pretends he isn't tired after, and he is. Mia, Ethan said, I'm just saying. Go back upstairs. I'm hungry. I'll bring you something. Mia considered this offer, apparently found it acceptable, and looked at Sloane one more time. Your head looks like it hurts, she said. It does, Sloane said. A little. Dad has good medicine. It tastes like grape, but it's actually medicine, not candy, even though it tastes like candy. Mia, upstairs. She went. They listened to her climb the stairs, each step deliberate, the rabbit trailing from her hand. Then the sound of her bedroom door, not quite closed. Sloane was looking at the staircase with an expression Ethan couldn't entirely read. How old? She asked. 7. She nodded and didn't say anything else, but something about the way she'd looked at the stairs stayed in the room even after the moment had passed. Ethan sat back down. Tell me about Victor Hale. Not the financial stuff. Him. Who is he? Sloane shifted on the couch, pulling the blanket slightly higher with her good hand. He's 61. He came from defense contracting. Spent 15 years running operational divisions at 2 of the largest contractors in the country before I brought him on. He's smart. Genuinely smart. Not just competent. Understands the business deeply. Understands government relationships. Knows how federal procurement works at a level that took me years to learn. She paused. He's also the kind of man who believes he was born to lead something larger than whatever he's currently running. Ambition. Consuming ambition. The kind that's fine when it's pointed in the right direction and dangerous when it isn't. She looked at her hands. I think he decided at some point that he'd helped build the company enough that he deserved more than he was getting. Equity. Control. A path to being the one running the table instead of sitting at it. And the money was a means to that end. The money and whatever he's built with it. $40 million moved carefully over 8 months, through enough obfuscation that it would have stayed invisible indefinitely if my auditor hadn't noticed one specific anomaly in one specific sub-report. She paused. He's been building something. I just don't know the full shape of it yet. What I do know is that the government contract he's been diverting funds from is classified at a level that, if this becomes public, doesn't just end careers. It ends freedom. Multiple people's freedom, including people with significant political exposure. Which is why he needs the story to be a tragic accident instead of a whistleblower reaching federal investigators. Yes. And why the filing of that incident report tells us he's not panicking, he's still executing. She looked at him. You think like an operator. I think like someone who's dealt with men who don't stop when the first approach fails, he said. They adjust. They try again. The blizzard and the mountain road were the clean version. Make it look like weather and geography did the work. That option is gone now. So they'll try something else. If they know you're alive, yes, and we already established that they almost certainly know you're alive. He looked at her directly. How many people at your company know your exact schedule and your route from last night? In theory, 3. My executive assistant, who I trust completely, and who was the one who told me about the ghost process, Victor, and 1 other member of the leadership team. She stopped. But if Victor had access to my communications long enough, he might have reconstructed things I never directly told him. The satellite communicator, Ethan said. Didn't you reach your federal contacts through that? The investigators you were going to meet? Yes. It's encrypted. It operates independently of the company's network. Does Hale know you have it? She thought about that. He knows I have satellite communication capability. He doesn't know the specific device or the encryption protocols. I acquired it through a personal vendor relationship specifically because I didn't want it in any company inventory. Use it to contact your investigators. Tell them what happened last night. Tell them you're alive, give them the evidence summary you were carrying, and tell them you need expedited action. They'll need the full records, not just the summary. Can you access those remotely? Not right now. Victor would have flagged my access the moment I disappeared. He'd be monitoring every login attempt on the company servers. She looked at the tablet in her lap. There may be a way in through a back channel, a secondary authentication path that I built in specifically for emergency access, that isn't routed through the standard administrative oversight. I haven't used it. It's meant as a last resort. This feels like a last resort. She almost smiled at that. Almost. I'll need time, she said, and a stable connection. The generator's running on a full tank. We've got power for at least 48 hours. He stood up. I'm going to make breakfast. Real breakfast, not toast. You should eat something before you try anything on that head. He paused. You're going to stay on that couch for at least an hour before you do anything that requires concentration. Head injuries don't care how many companies you run. Sloane opened her mouth, and he could see the reflex, the automatic resistance of a person who is not accustomed to being told to sit down by someone she just met. But then something in her recalibrated, and the reflex didn't make it all the way out. Fine, she said. Good. He went to the kitchen. He could hear her after a moment, shifting on the couch, picking up the satellite communicator, then setting it back down like she was honoring the instruction even though it cost her something to do it. He started the eggs. It was the kind of morning that should have been ordinary. The sounds of the house, the smell of coffee, the storm outside doing what storms do. It wasn't ordinary, and they both knew it, but there was something in the routineness of making breakfast in the face of not ordinary that Ethan had always found steadying. You eat, you think, you figure out what comes next. He cracked 4 eggs into the pan and thought about the tire tracks. He thought about the incident report filed 15 minutes after the crash. He thought about a man named Victor Hale, 61 years old, smart in the consuming way, somewhere out there in the blizzard or beyond it, running calculations of his own. He thought about Mia upstairs. And then he stopped thinking about what he didn't want and started thinking about what he needed to do. Because those had become 2 different things the moment he saw those tire tracks disappear off the edge of the mountain road, and there was no distance left between them now. The eggs sizzled in the pan. The storm kept coming. Downstairs, Sloane Whitaker sat on the couch with a satellite communicator in her lap and evidence of $40 million stolen dollars in her tablet, and did not pick up her company phone. She wouldn't turn it on for the rest of the day. Ethan understood, without her telling him, that she already knew why, and that she'd been sitting with that particular fear for longer than last night. The phone was a leash. Whatever was in it, whoever could reach her through it, she'd made the decision to cut the line. That told him more about her situation than anything she'd said out loud. He divided the eggs onto 2 plates, put the bread in the toaster, and called up the stairs that food was ready, and listened to the very fast sound of a 7-year-old who had been awake since before 5 and was now, finally, getting breakfast. 3 people in a house in a blizzard, 23 miles from the nearest town, and Victor Hale out there somewhere still executing. The toast popped up. Ethan put the plates on the table and sat down and ate his eggs while they were still hot, because in his experience, you eat when you can, and you sleep when you can, and you don't waste either one, because the moment when you can't do either of those things comes faster than you expect and lasts longer than you'd like. He was still eating when Sloane came to the kitchen doorway, blanket around her shoulders, tablet under her arm, satellite communicator in her good hand. The back channel works, she said. I'm in the server. He looked up. Victor locked out my standard credentials at 4:47 this morning, she said. 44 minutes after the crash. She looked at the screen. He was awake. He was watching. He knew exactly when to move. How long to get what you need off the server? The complete financial evidence package. Maybe 2 hours. Maybe 3. It's a lot of data. Then sit down and eat something first, Ethan said, and then we start. She looked at the plate he'd set on the table. He'd made a 3rd one, on the assumption that she'd come around once the food was ready. And for just a second, the calculation behind her eyes stopped. Just for a second. Then she sat down, set the tablet and the communicator on the table beside the plate, and picked up a fork. Mia appeared in the kitchen doorway behind her, still holding the rabbit, eyeing the new person at the table with the focused attention of a scientist, observing a previously undocumented specimen in a familiar habitat. Are you staying for a while? Mia asked. Sloane looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at his eggs. Maybe, Sloane said carefully. Is that okay? Mia thought about it with the seriousness it apparently deserved. You can sleep in the guest room, she said, but Dad changed the sheets last month, so they might be a little stiff. He doesn't use fabric softener because he says it's unnecessary. Mia, it's true. It's fine, Sloane said, and something in her voice had shifted, just slightly, just enough that Ethan caught it, from the controlled flatness she'd been maintaining all morning to something that sounded, briefly, like a person rather than a CEO. "Stiff sheets are fine." Mia nodded, satisfied, and climbed into her chair. The three of them ate breakfast together in the middle of a blizzard, in a house that 24 hours ago had held exactly 2 people and a reasonable approximation of a quiet life. And somewhere past the storm, Victor Hale was looking at a blank incident report with no follow-up, no body confirmation, and a growing understanding that something had gone wrong. He would be making phone calls by now. He would be sending people. Ethan knew this the way he knew the sound of his own truck engine, not because he'd thought it through step by step, but because he'd spent 12 years learning how men like that operated, and men like that did not accept failure as a final answer. They adjusted, and they tried again. The data transfer took 3 hours and 11 minutes. Ethan knew this because he watched it, not the screen, but Sloane. He watched the way she sat at his kitchen table with the tablet propped against the fruit bowl. He never put fruit in, the satellite communicator running a dedicated encrypted channel, her good hand moving across the screen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 11 years knowing exactly where every important thing lived inside her own systems. She didn't ask for help. She didn't explain what she was doing. She worked the way people work when they've been doing something alone for so long that the idea of narrating it to another person doesn't occur to them. He brought her coffee twice. She drank it without looking up. Mia, for her part, had decided that Sloane Whitaker was the most interesting thing to happen in this house since the time a mule deer had walked directly onto the porch and eaten the potted plant that Ethan had been keeping alive in defiance of all evidence that he had any capacity for keeping plants alive. She circled the kitchen doorway at irregular intervals, not entering, not leaving, just appearing long enough to observe and then retreating back to whatever she was doing in the living room. Ethan let it go. Mia's version of giving someone space was different from most people's version, but it was still, technically, space. By 11 in the morning, the snow had slowed to something that looked almost manageable from the kitchen window. Still coming down, still thick, but the wind had dropped, and the visibility had opened up from essentially nothing to maybe a quarter mile. Ethan stood at the window with his third coffee and looked out at the driveway, the fence line, the pale shapes of the pine trees on the eastern slope of the property. He'd been doing this every 20 minutes since breakfast. Not anxiously, just as information gathering. The same way he used to check the perimeter, not because he expected to find anything, but because the act of checking meant that if something was there, he'd see it before it saw him. The property sat in a natural bowl with a single access road coming in from the county route, which meant that any vehicle approaching had to come from one direction. On 3 sides, the terrain dropped off steeply into pine forest that was difficult to navigate in daylight and nearly impossible in snow. These were facts he'd noted when he bought the place, not because he'd been planning for anything in particular, but because you don't spend 12 years in the teams without developing a permanent habit of assessing ground. It was a good position, defensively. He hated that he was thinking about it in those terms. "It's done," Sloane said. He turned from the window. She was looking at the satellite communicator, not the tablet, and her expression was one he hadn't seen on her yet. Something caught between relief and the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding something up by sheer force of will and has just been allowed to set it down. "The full package?" "Everything. Financial records, transaction logs. The Ghost process documentation from my IT director, travel records showing the correlation between my schedule leaks and Victor's calendar." She set the communicator down on the table. "It's with both investigators and copied to a federal judge in the 10th Circuit who I trust. There are also copies on 2 separate encrypted cloud servers that I control through personal accounts Victor doesn't know exist." "Who else has the access codes for those servers?" "My executive assistant. And now you." She looked at him steadily. "I'm telling you that because if something happens to me in the next 24 hours, someone needs to know those files exist and how to reach them." Ethan sat down across from her. "Nothing is going to happen to you in the next 24 hours. "You don't know that." "No," he said. "I don't, but I'm planning accordingly." She studied him for a moment. There was something she wanted to say. He could see it working behind her eyes, the same evaluating look she'd had that first morning when she was deciding how much to tell him, but softer now, less defended. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "And I mean that genuinely. You could have dropped me at the highway, Or, you could have called the sheriff and waited. You didn't have to bring me here, and you certainly didn't have to. She gestured at the tablet, the communicator, the general situation. He thought about how to answer that honestly. Because whoever did this to you didn't stop to think about what else was on that mountain road, he said. They didn't think about whether someone else would come along, whether a kid would be in the back seat of the car they forced off the road, whether it would matter. He paused. People who don't stop to think about that don't stop. They keep going, and I have a 7-year-old upstairs who's already been through more uncertainty than she should have been. And I am not going to sit in this kitchen and wait for Victor Hale to decide that an isolated ranch house is an acceptable casualty. Sloane was quiet for a moment. Your wife, she said. Mia's mother. He'd expected the question eventually. He kept his voice even. She died 4 years ago. Aneurysm. No warning, nothing anyone could have prevented. She was 34. I'm sorry. So is Mia. He said it without self-pity, just as a fact. She doesn't remember her mother very well anymore. She was 3. She remembers feelings more than specifics. That's what the grief counselor told us, that young children retain emotional impressions longer than factual memory. So Mia remembers feeling safe, and she remembers something big and warm, and she draws pictures sometimes of a woman with red hair, even though she probably doesn't consciously know that's what she's doing. He stopped. Anyway, you asked why I'm doing this. That's part of it. Sloane looked at the staircase, the same way she'd looked at it that morning, with something in her expression he still couldn't name precisely. She's remarkable, she said. She says whatever she thinks. She has no filter whatsoever. I keep waiting for it to develop. Don't rush it, Sloane said quietly. And there was something in those 2 words that sounded like it came from somewhere personal, though she didn't elaborate and he didn't ask. The afternoon ground forward the way afternoons do in snowstorms, slowly, with a muffled quality to everything, the world outside reduced to one color and one sound. Ethan fed the livestock through the back, wading through snow that had drifted chest-high in the space between the house and the barn. He broke ice on the water troughs, put out extra hay, spent 45 minutes doing the kind of physical work that doesn't require thought, which was useful because his brain needed the space to run through things without interference. When he came back inside, stamping snow off his boots in the mudroom, he could hear Mia talking. He stood still for a moment in the doorway to the kitchen. Mia was at the table, sitting across from Sloane, and she had produced from somewhere, her room, presumably, the worn spiral notebook she used for drawing, and she was showing Sloane something in it with the serious, proprietary pride of a person sharing work they care about. That's the barn, Mia was saying. And that's the horse. Her name is Ruthie, but Dad calls her Ruth when she's in trouble, which is a lot. And that's the mountain, but I made it too pointy. I know, real mountains aren't that pointy. Sloane was looking at the notebook with the kind of attention she'd given the financial records, genuine and focused. I don't know. I think it's a pretty great mountain. It's pointy. Mountains can be pointy. Not like that. Some are, Sloane said. The Matterhorn in Switzerland is actually pretty close to that pointy. Mia looked at her with a different quality of attention now. The specific look of a child recalibrating their assessment of an adult who has just said something unexpectedly interesting. Have you been there? To Switzerland? Yes, for work. What do you do? I run a company that protects computer systems from people who try to break into them. Mia considered this, like a hacker catcher, something like that. Dad says hackers are mostly just people who are too smart and too bored. Sloane's eyes moved to the doorway and found Ethan standing there. He hadn't moved. Your dad's not wrong, she said. He came into the kitchen, pulled off his jacket, hung it on the hook by the back door. Mia turned a page in the notebook to show Sloane something else, and Sloane looked at it, and the afternoon went on. It was the most domestic hour Ethan had spent in a long time, which was why he didn't entirely trust it. Quiet hours in his experience had a tendency to be structural, the lull that precedes a change in situation, and he'd been conditioned to appreciate them without relaxing into them. You could be grateful for a calm moment and still keep one eye on the tree line. He was looking at the tree line at 3:47 in the afternoon when he saw the headlights. Not one set. 3. Coming up the access road in a line, spaced apart, moving slowly but with purpose. The deliberate pace of vehicles whose drivers knew where they were going and weren't in any hurry because they'd already decided how this was going to go. His first instinct, the animal instinct that predated rational thought by several evolutionary stages, was very clear about what needed to happen in the next 60 seconds. He didn't fight it. He'd learned a long time ago that the instinct was frequently right, and that the part of his brain that wanted to argue with it was frequently making excuses. "Mia," he said. His voice came out the same as it always did. That was important. She looked up from the notebook. "Go to your room and get your emergency bag. Don't pack anything extra, just the bag. Bring your heaviest coat and your snow boots." She looked at him, 7 years old, and she knew the difference between his regular voice and his specific voice. And this was his specific voice, the one she'd heard exactly twice before in her life, and both times had preceded something that required her to move quickly and quietly and without questions. She got up without asking why. He would tell her later, when later was available. "Sloane!" She was already looking at him, already reading the situation from his posture and expression. 3 vehicles coming up the access road. She was on her feet with the tablet and communicator before he finished the sentence. "Can you see who—" "Not yet. One of them matches the body type of a vehicle from your corporate security fleet." She went still for just a fraction of a second. "Black Suburban?" "Black Suburban." He watched her face run through the same calculation he'd just run, the hope that flickered for a half second and then went out. Because if it were legitimate help, there would be 1 vehicle, not 3. There would be a phone call ahead of time. There would be emergency lights. There would not be a deliberate approach in a convoy formation with the headlights angled to avoid reflecting off the house's security cameras, which was what he was watching happen right now, and which required a specific and calculated awareness of where those cameras were pointed. "They're not here to help you," he said. "No," she said. "They're not." He was already moving. He crossed to the hall closet, opened the false back panel that he'd installed himself 2 years ago for reasons that had seemed paranoid at the time and no longer seemed that way at all, and pulled out what he kept there. A tactical belt, a 9mm Glock 17, 2 extra magazines, and a compact radio unit. He put the belt on over his flannel shirt, checked the Glock by feel and muscle memory without looking at it, holstered it. He turned around. Sloane was watching him with an expression he recognized as recalibration, the moment when someone's existing model of who you are gets replaced by something more accurate. "Storm shelter," he said. "There's an entrance in the floor of the mudroom, under the rug and the plywood panel. It looks like a utility access. It's a concrete room, 8 by 10, insulated, with a battery backup for heat and light. There's water, food, a first aid kit, and a hardline communication terminal that runs to the satellite array independently of the house systems." Mia appeared in the kitchen doorway, with her backpack over both shoulders and her coat already on and zipped. "Good girl," Ethan said. "Come here." She came. He crouched down to her level, and she looked at him with the serious brown eyes that were her mother's eyes, and had been breaking his heart gently and continuously for 4 years. "There are some people coming to the house," he said. "I need you and Sloane to go somewhere safe while I talk to them. Do you understand?" "Are they bad people?" He thought about lying, decided against it. "I don't know yet. That's what I need to find out." "But you're putting your belt on." He couldn't argue with that. "Yeah, I am." "Okay," she said. It was the smallest word she could have said, and somehow also the biggest. He put his hand on the side of her face for a moment, the kind of touch that doesn't translate into anything sayable, that exists in a register that precedes language. And then he stood up. "Sloane goes with you. You show her the shelter, you show her the communication panel, and you stay there until I come back. Both of you. Nobody comes out until I come to the door and knock 4 times. Not 3, not 5, 4. Mia nodded. 4, she repeated, committing it. He looked at Sloane. "The terminal in the shelter has a direct line to the satellite communicator's secondary channel. If you don't hear from me in 90 minutes, you use it." "To call who?" "Your federal investigators, and then the county sheriff, and then anyone else you can reach." He paused. "But I'll be back in less than 90 minutes. She held his gaze. There were things moving behind her eyes. Fear, probably, but also something harder than fear. The same thing he'd seen in her face that first morning when she'd been deciding whether to tell him the truth. Determination, maybe. The refusal to be entirely a passenger in her own crisis. "Don't do anything that can't be undone," she said. "That's always the plan," he said. It wasn't exactly a reassurance, and they both knew it, but she nodded anyway. Mia took Sloane's good hand and led her to the mudroom without being asked, which meant she already knew where the shelter entrance was, which meant she'd found it on her own at some point. Of course she had. And Ethan filed that away to deal with later. He watched them go. Then he turned off every light in the house. The darkness came in total and immediate, and he let his eyes adjust, which took about 45 seconds. And while they adjusted, he moved to the front window and looked out at the driveway. The three vehicles had stopped about 200 yards from the house. Their headlights were off now. In the dim blue-gray light of a winter afternoon with cloud cover and falling snow, they were shapes more than vehicles, dark masses against the white of the driveway and the white of the fields on either side. He counted the doors. First vehicle, 2 men, front and rear. Second vehicle, 3. Third vehicle, 2, plus the driver who stayed inside. 8 people. Possibly more he couldn't see. They were fanning out, not coming straight up the driveway, splitting, 2 going left toward the fence line, 2 going right toward the barn side, and 2 staying on the access road in what was meant to look like a frontal approach, but was actually a drawing of attention while the flankers got into position. Classic, clean, not amateur hour. These were not panicked men improvising. These were people who had been briefed, who had been told the layout of the property, and who had a plan. Someone had been thorough. Victor Hale had been thorough. Ethan had spent 12 years learning to work against thorough people. He went to the back door. The cold hit him as he stepped outside. That same deep Colorado cold, 11 degrees or close to it, the wind carrying a fine surface snow that stung any exposed skin. He moved along the back of the house in the shadow of the eaves, staying low, placing his feet in the packed snow rather than the loose drifted stuff that would crunch. Behind the house, the terrain dropped away into a shallow depression before rising again toward the pine forest on the east slope. It was dark back here, genuinely dark, the house blocking any ambient light from the vehicles out front. He went to the barn first. Ruthie was agitated. She could sense the tension, or smell the strangers, or both. Horses were reliable barometers. One of them shouted something he couldn't hear clearly over the distance and the wind. The low spot in the field was about 30 feet ahead of where they'd stopped. If they moved toward the barn, they'd find it. They moved toward the barn. The first man went in up to his knee, and the surprise of it, the sudden plunge through what had looked like solid ground, sent him sideways and sideways in deep snow. When you're already off balance is a committed process. He went down. The second man stopped to help him, which meant both of them were stationary and occupied. Ethan was already moving to the east side of the barn, out the back, into the shadow of the tree line. The 2 men from the right flank had gotten closer to the house than the left side pair. They were maybe 60 yards from the back wall, moving in a 2-man configuration with one slightly behind and to the right of the other. The lead man had something in his hand, and in the floodlight wash from the other side of the property, Ethan could see it clearly enough. He also had something in his hand. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not clean, and it was not the way things looked in films, and Ethan would not think about it with any satisfaction afterward. It was cold and loud in the brief moments it was loud, and it was physical in the way that things are physical when they happen in snow and darkness, and under the specific kind of pressure that compresses time into something that runs faster than your ability to fully register it. 2 men went down on the east side, neither of them permanently, but neither of them getting back up quickly either. One of them had a broken nose from the impact with the frozen ground that Ethan was not apologetic about. He moved back toward the house. The frontal approach. The 2 men on the access road had made it to the porch. They were at the door, and from the sounds reaching him, they were not knocking. He went around the south side of the house, through the gap between the propane tank and the exterior wall, and came at the porch from the angle they weren't watching because they were focused on the door. He hit the porch boards at a run, took the 2 steps in one stride, and what followed was brief and very close quarters, and left one man sitting against the porch railing with his head in his hands, and the other one face down in the snow with his wrists zip-tied behind him, using ties from Ethan's vest pocket, because he was a person who kept zip ties on his person in the same category of habit as keeping his truck's emergency kit always stocked. Ethan stood on the porch, breathing hard, and looked out at the driveway. The third vehicle. The driver was still inside, and beside the driver, a shape in the passenger seat that Ethan hadn't been able to see clearly from the house window because the angle was wrong. A second person. Not moving, not participating in the approach. Watching. The vehicle's door opened. The man who got out was not young, and he was not built like the others, not the operational build of men you send to do difficult things in difficult weather. He was tall, lean, dressed in a wool overcoat that was completely wrong for the temperature, like a man who'd gotten into a vehicle in a heated garage and hadn't anticipated standing in a Colorado field in 11-degree weather. Silver-haired, even from this distance, deliberate in his movements, the gait of a man accustomed to rooms where his entry changes the atmosphere. He walked up the driveway toward the porch. He was alone. He'd left the driver in the vehicle. He came with his hands visible, not raised, not the gesture of surrender, just the gesture of a man who wanted to be seen clearly and who understood the power of appearing unafraid. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. Ethan looked at him. "Mr. Calder," the man said. His voice carried easily across the cold air. Low, measured, the kind of voice that had spent decades practicing the trick of sounding reasonable under any circumstance. "Victor Hale," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. Something shifted in Hale's expression. Not surprise exactly, but a reevaluation, the look of a man recalibrating. "She's told you about me." "Enough." "Then she's also told you that this is considerably more complicated than it may appear from where you're standing." He looked at the man zip-tied in the snow, then back at Ethan, and his expression didn't change appreciably. "You've handled yourself impressively tonight. I mean that without any condescension. What do you want?" "To resolve this without any further unpleasantness." He said the word unpleasantness the way a corporate attorney says it, as a technical descriptor, not a moral judgment. "I want Sloane. I want 5 minutes with Sloane, and whatever she's been transmitting through that satellite communicator she thinks I don't know about, and then I want to walk away from this property and not come back." "She's not here," Ethan said. Hale looked at him steadily. "Mr. Calder, I know she's here. I know you pulled her out of the vehicle on Ridge Route 7 at approximately 4:15 this morning. I know you drove her to this property. I know she's been accessing the company's secure servers through an emergency back-channel credential she built for herself in which, I'll admit, I only discovered this afternoon." A pause. "I know your daughter's name is Mia. She's 7 years old. She attends school in Pine Haven. She rides a horse named Ruthie." The cold air between them didn't move. Ethan felt something happen in his chest. Not fear, exactly, or not only fear. Something older and more fundamental. The thing that lives underneath every other thing in a parent, the instinct that has no name because it predates language. He kept his face still. "You're threatening my daughter," Ethan said. "I'm providing context," Hale said. "Context for the decision you need to make in the next 2 minutes. You're one man. You've done impressive work tonight with a 6-person team, and I won't minimize that. But I have resources and patience that you don't, and I have a 7-year-old girl's school schedule." He let that sit for a moment. "Give me Sloane. Let me finish this cleanly, and I will personally guarantee that you and your daughter are never part of this story again." The wind came across the field from the north and threw a curtain of surface snow across the driveway between them. Ethan stood on his porch, in the cold, in the dark, looking at the man who had tried to kill a woman on a mountain road, and who was now saying his daughter's name with the casual precision of someone making a business point. And something that had been sitting in him all day, all year maybe, all 7 years since he'd come home and built this quiet life and tried very sincerely to become a person who didn't do the things he used to do, something in him stopped debating. Not anger. It wasn't exactly anger. Anger was hot and imprecise and made you stupid. This was colder than that. This was the thing that lives underneath anger. 2 minutes, Hale said, and looked at his watch. Not threatening, just reminding. The gesture of a man who has a schedule. Ethan looked at him. "You made a mistake," Ethan said. "Coming here yourself." Hale looked up from his watch. "A man who sends people to do difficult things," Ethan said, "should know what those people are capable of before he assumes they failed because of the difficulty." He stepped off the porch, down the 2 steps, into the snow. "Your 6 people had a plan for an isolated rancher protecting 2 frightened women." He walked toward Hale at a normal pace, neither hurried nor slow. "That's not what they found," he said. Victor Hale was 61 years old. and had spent his adult life in boardrooms and government buildings and the well-heated offices of men who send other people to do difficult things. He understood power as a concept. He understood leverage and pressure and the mechanics of forcing outcomes. He had not, until this specific moment on a Colorado ranch in a blizzard, stood in front of someone who had spent 12 years learning exactly how to walk toward a man in exactly this way, and he did not know what to do with the information his body was giving him about it. He took one step back, just one, but it was enough. "Your mistake," Ethan said, stopping 2 feet from him, "is that you came out of that car." Hale opened his mouth. "Because now," Ethan said, "you're not in Denver managing this from a distance. You're here, on a private property, in the dark, with 6 people who are going to need medical attention and a federal conspiracy charge that your evidence is already building, and you're standing in front of me." He looked at Hale steadily. "And you just threatened my daughter." The driver's door of the third vehicle opened. Ethan didn't look at it. He kept his eyes on Hale. "Tell him to stop," Ethan said quietly. Hale said nothing for 2 seconds. Then, "Wait." The driver stopped. "Here's what's going to happen," Ethan said. "You're going to walk back to that vehicle. You and your driver are going to stay on this property until federal agents get here, which is going to happen considerably faster than you'd like, because the woman you tried to kill spent this morning sending everything she has to people who are now very motivated to move quickly." He paused. "You had one option when you came up that driveway tonight, and that was to turn around. That option is gone." Hale stared at him. The calculation was visible. Running the numbers, looking for the move, finding the board shorter than it was supposed to be. "You have no idea," Hale said. "How many people are involved in this? How many layers? You think you've—" "I don't need to know all the layers," Ethan said. "That's not my job tonight. My job tonight is to make sure Sloane Whitaker is alive in the morning, and you're not. Not dead. I mean, you're not in a position to finish what you started on that mountain road." He held Hale's gaze. "I've done my job." He stepped back and to the side, clearing a path back to the vehicle. Hale stood there in his wool overcoat that was wrong for the temperature, in the floodlit snow of a Colorado ranch, and looked like a man who had just discovered that the room he'd walked into had walls where he expected doorways. He turned and walked back to the vehicle. Ethan watched him get in. He watched the door close. He watched the vehicle sit there, stationary, exactly as he'd told it to. Then he pulled out the radio unit from his vest and keyed the shelter's hardline frequency. "Sloane." A pause. Then her voice, controlled but not entirely steady. "I'm here. Call your investigators. Tell them Victor Hale is on my property. Tell them to move now." A longer pause. "He's there?" she said. "He came himself?" "He came himself." Silence on the line for a moment. He could hear her breathing. "Is everyone—" "Everyone's fine. 4 times on the door when I come back. Don't come out before that." He released the key. The floodlights were still blazing across the snow, turning the field into something that looked almost peaceful from a distance. All that white light, all that white snow, the dark shapes of the trees on the edge of it, in the middle of the yard, and breathed the cold air and let his heart rate come down from wherever it had been. His hands were steady. That was the thing he'd always noticed, going back to his first real deployment, the thing that had surprised him about himself. Not that he was fearless, because he wasn't, but that his hands stayed steady even when the rest of him understood perfectly well what fear was for. He didn't know if that was a gift or something closer to a deficiency, and he'd mostly stopped trying to decide. He looked at the third vehicle, sitting still in the driveway. He looked at the man zip-tied in the snow, who was starting to make sounds that suggested the cold was registering. He looked at his house, dark, quiet, looking from the outside like nobody was home. Somewhere beneath the floor of the mudroom, his 7-year-old daughter was sitting in a concrete room with a woman she'd met this morning, and she was probably asking that woman questions, the way she asked questions about everything, relentlessly and without embarrassment, because Mia had decided at some age Ethan couldn't precisely identify that the world was primarily a source of information and she was primarily a collector of it. He hoped Sloane was answering. He went back to the porch. He had people to secure, evidence to preserve, and federal agents to wait for, and his hands were steady, and the snow was still falling, and Victor Hale was sitting in a vehicle in his driveway, having apparently discovered that the room had walls where he'd expected doorways. Ethan sat down on the porch step and waited. The wait was the hardest part. It always had been, even going back to his team's days. Not the action, not the moment when things were happening and your training took over and your body knew what to do before your brain finished forming the instruction. The hard part was always the waiting. The sitting in position, watching a fixed point, feeling time move at its geological pace while your mind tried to fill the silence with everything that could go wrong. Ethan sat on the porch step and watched Victor Hale's vehicle and did not let his mind do that. He had zip-tied the man from the frontal approach to the porch railing, not because the railing would hold against a determined effort, but because the man's right knee had been hyperextended in the scuffle and determined effort wasn't currently available to him. He was sitting against the post with his head tilted back, breathing through his mouth, not looking at Ethan. The second man from the frontal pair had taken a harder impact and was semi-conscious in the snow at the porch's edge, which Ethan had decided was acceptable given the alternative of leaving him mobile. The two men from the right flank were down in the field somewhere east of the barn. Ethan had checked them twice since coming back to the porch. Both were secured, both were conscious, both were cold and unhappy, and in no condition to complicate anything. The left flank pair, the ones who'd gone into the soft ice field, were a more complicated situation. One of them had genuinely gone in up to his hip before his partner dragged him clear, and the wet cold at those temperatures was a problem that didn't wait for convenient timing. Ethan had made a decision about that, which was the kind of decision he didn't enjoy making but that had a clear, correct answer. He'd zip-tied them together, wrist to wrist, and moved them to the lee side of the barn where the wind couldn't touch them and the body heat of two people in contact could do something useful. He'd put his spare work jacket over the wet one's legs. The man had looked at him when he did that, a specific look, the look of someone whose model of who they're dealing with has just been revised in a direction they weren't expecting. Ethan didn't say anything about it. He went back to the porch. That had been 40 minutes ago. His radio clicked. Ethan. Sloane's voice on the hard line from the shelter, compressed and slightly flat from the encryption processing, but clear enough. I have one of the investigators on the satellite communicator. She wants to talk to you. Put her through. A brief electronic handshake sound, and then a new voice, female, precise, with the particular cadence of someone who had spent years conducting conversations in which every word needed to be recoverable and unambiguous. Mr. Calder, this is Special Investigator Dana Reeves. I've been briefed on the situation at your location. I need a status report. Victor Hale is on site, Ethan said. Third vehicle at the end of my access road. One driver, Hale in the passenger seat, both stationary. 6 additional personnel on the property in various states of incapacity, all secured, all conscious, none requiring immediate medical evacuation, though 2 should be checked for hypothermia within the next 90 minutes. A pause. You secured 6 individuals. Yes. Another pause, slightly longer. Mr. Calder, we have a federal response team currently 40 minutes out from your location by vehicle, and we're coordinating with the Colorado State Police who have a helicopter that's evaluating weather clearance. The storm system has opened a window. They may be able to get a bird to you in under an hour. The access road can take standard vehicles, but it hasn't been plowed. Chain-up required or high-clearance 4-wheel drive. Understood. Can you maintain the current situation for 60 to 90 minutes? He looked at the vehicle sitting in his driveway. Hale hadn't moved. The driver hadn't moved. The vehicle's exhaust was a slow white curl in the dark air. Yes, he said. One more thing, Reeves said. Ms. Whitaker told us that Hale mentioned a relationship with a deputy director in a federal agency's financial crimes division. We've been aware of that possibility for approximately 3 weeks. He has been removed from any involvement in this matter and is under his own separate inquiry. Ms. Whitaker's transmission tonight went through a completely clean channel. Good, Ethan said. Is she all right? He looked at the shelter entrance, the plywood panel in the mudroom floor that looked like nothing from the outside and was, at this moment, the only thing between Sloane Whitaker and Victor Hale's understanding of where she was. She's all right, he said. Tell her. Reeves paused, and the professional precision in her voice shifted very slightly, enough to be noticeable. Tell her she did the right thing, coming forward. I know what that cost. He released the key, sat with the radio in his lap, and looked out at the driveway. The vehicle's exhaust kept rising. Inside it, Victor Hale was doing what cornered intelligent men do, running every remaining option, looking for the calculation that still produced an acceptable outcome. Ethan had seen that process from the outside before, and he knew what it looked like when the options ran out. Sometimes men accepted it with a kind of flat grace, the way a chess player tips their king when the board is clear. Sometimes they didn't. He watched the vehicle. At the 58-minute mark, the driver's door opened. Not Hale. The driver, younger, the build of someone who'd been hired for physical capability rather than judgment, and who was now standing in 11-degree weather, looking at the situation on the porch and the porch railing and the general state of the property and performing a rapid personal risk assessment. He looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back at him. "Sit down," Ethan said. "On the hood, hands where I can see them." The driver sat on the hood. His hands were visible. He didn't look like he wanted to be anywhere other than exactly where he'd been told to be. The passenger door didn't open. Ethan waited. Then the radio clicked again. Not Sloane's channel, his own radio unit, the secondary frequency he hadn't been using. Someone was querying it. He looked at the radio, then at the vehicle, then picked it up and clicked receive. "You're better than I anticipated," Victor Hale's voice said. Different from the porch. Smaller, the warmth of the car having done something to the edges of the professional control. Not rattled, exactly, but adjusted. A man who has revised his expectations and is operating in the updated reality. "I'll give you that without qualification." "What do you want, Hale?" "I want to have a conversation that doesn't require me to stand in the cold. You can talk from where you are." A pause. The financial evidence she transmitted, the package she sent tonight and this morning. There are elements of it that don't tell the complete story. Details that, out of context, implicate people who had no knowledge of what I was doing. Ethan said nothing. "I'm not telling you this to negotiate," Hale said. "I understand the negotiation window is closed. I'm telling you because it's true, and because the federal process that's now in motion is going to move fast, and it's going to catch people in its periphery who don't deserve to be caught there." Another pause. "There are employees, junior finance staff who process transactions they were told were routine. A subcontractor who built shell infrastructure based on falsified authorization documents. They're in those records, and they look complicit, and they're not." Ethan thought about that. "Tell your attorneys," he said. "That's what they're for. My attorneys will be managing my situation. Nobody will be managing theirs." "Then tell the investigators yourself, when they get here." The line was quiet for a moment. "You're not going to—" "I'm not your intermediary, Hale. I'm the man who's keeping you on this property until the people who handle what comes next arrive." Ethan paused. "If you want to do something useful with the next hour, make a list of names and what you know about them. Give it to the investigators when they show up. That's the only move you have that has any value." The radio was quiet. Then, "She's lucky. Finding someone like you at 4 in the morning on a mountain road." Ethan didn't answer that. He set the radio down on the porch step. Sloane heard the 4 knocks 47 minutes later. She knew it was him because the rhythm was the same. Not hesitant, not hurried, just 4 deliberate raps with the knuckle, evenly spaced, the knock of a man who does things the way he said he would do them. Mia was already on her feet. She'd been sitting next to Sloane on the concrete bench that ran along one wall of the shelter. And for the past 40 minutes, she had been doing something that Sloane had not expected and could not have predicted, which was talking. Not about the situation, not about the men outside, not about any of the things that Sloane's own mind had been circling with increasing intensity. Mia had been talking about horses, specifically about Ruthie, and Ruthie's various personality failings, which were apparently extensive and lovingly catalogued. Ruthie was stubborn in the mornings. Ruthie had a habit of leaning into people when she wanted something, which wasn't aggressive but which applied a surprising amount of force for something that was meant to be affectionate. Ruthie had once eaten an entire hat, not the brim, the whole hat, and shown no remorse. Sloane had listened to all of this with the focused attention she'd been unable to direct anywhere else, because the focused attention needed somewhere to go and Mia was offering it a place. And somewhere in the middle of the Ruthie anecdotes she had felt the white-knuckle grip of the previous 20 hours loosen, not because the danger was gone, but because she was sitting next to a 7-year-old who was treating this concrete room as a minor interruption to the more interesting subject of an opinionated horse. And the sheer mundane specificity of it was the most grounding thing she'd experienced all day. When the knocks came, Mia pulled the panel open before Sloane could move. 4, Mia confirmed, looking up through the opening. Ethan's face appeared above them. He looked like a man who had been outside in 11-degree weather for a long time and had decided not to make anything of it. There was a cut on his chin that hadn't been there before, and his jacket was torn at the left shoulder, and his eyes went to Mia first and then to Sloane. "Everyone okay?" he said. "We're fine," Sloane said. "Are you?" "Fine." He reached a hand down to Mia, who took it and came up through the hatch in the single athletic movement of a child who'd done that hatch enough times to have a technique. Then he reached for Sloane, who took his hand and came up more carefully, her splinted wrist making the climb awkward. When she was standing in the mudroom, she looked at him properly. "The cut," she said. "It's nothing. It's bleeding. It's mostly stopped." He looked at her with that flat, assessing gaze. "Hale is contained. Federal team is approximately 20 minutes out. State police helicopter confirmed in the air." Sloane let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately an hour. "The evidence?" she started. "Reeves has everything. She said to tell you that you did the right thing, coming forward." He paused. Her words, not mine, though they're accurate. Something in Sloane's chest did a complicated thing that she attributed to the past 20 hours and the concrete room and the residue of sustained fear, and absolutely not to the way Ethan Calder had just delivered someone else's words in his particular way of delivering things. Plainly, without decoration, as if the simplest form of a true thing was always the most sufficient. "Is he?" she said. "He's in the vehicle. Hasn't tried anything. I think he's writing a list." She stared at him. "A list of what?" "Names. People who were used without knowing it." A pause. "It was his idea, for what that's worth." She processed that. For what that's worth. Which was a complicated amount, and they both knew it, and neither of them tried to resolve it in the mudroom at 11:30 at night, with Mia standing between them, listening to everything with the specific quality of attention she brought to things she wasn't going to ask about immediately, but was definitely going to ask about later. "I need to be there," Sloane said, "when the investigators arrive. I need to walk them through the evidence myself." "I know. And I need access to my company's communication systems. There are people on my executive team who don't know any of this is happening, and by morning it's going to be—" She stopped, recalculating. "It's already going to be. Victor locked out my standard credentials at 4:47 this morning. By now, there will be questions. My executive assistant will be— Use the satellite communicator," Ethan said. "Call who you need to call. You've got 20 minutes before the federal team gets here, and the first thing those 20 minutes should include is something to eat and something warm to drink, because you've been in a concrete room for the last hour, and your color is not great." "My color is fine." "It's genuinely not." Mia, without being asked, had already drifted toward the kitchen, apparently having decided that the most useful contribution she could make to this moment was producing food, which was something she had observed her father doing in response to most difficult situations. "She's going to try to make hot chocolate," Ethan said. "Is she allowed?" "She knows how. It's not complicated." He paused. "She'll add too many marshmallows." "That's not a problem," Sloane said. Something moved through his expression. Not a smile, the thing that lives next to a smile. Then he turned and led her to the kitchen. The federal vehicles came up the access road at 12:14. Headlights visible from the kitchen window long before the sound of the engines reached the house. 3 vehicles, these ones with proper emergency lighting and the kind of federal plates that meant what they said. Behind them, the blue-red scatter of Colorado State Police and 2 cruisers. Ethan went out to meet them. What followed was the part of these situations that he'd always found, in a different context, the most strange. The transition from inside the event to outside it. The moment when the institutional machinery arrived, and the thing that had been deeply, personally urgent became procedural. Forms and jurisdictions and chain of custody, and the specific choreography of federal agents approaching a scene, which was precise and careful and completely indifferent to how any individual person in the middle of it happened to feel. He gave his account to a federal agent named Torres, who had the humorless competence of a man who processed situations like this with the same emotional register other people use for tax preparation. Ethan liked him immediately for exactly that reason. Victor Hale was removed from the vehicle in handcuffs that went on without incident or drama. The flat grace Ethan had anticipated. The chess player who knows when the board is clear. He walked to the federal vehicle without speaking to anyone, without looking at the house, without performing any of the defiant gestures that smaller men might reach for in that moment. He was, whatever else he was, not a small man. Ethan didn't admire him, but he could make that distinction without confusion. The 6 personnel were processed one by one. Medical assessments, restraint transitions from zip ties to proper cuffs, brief individual interviews. The 2 hypothermia cases were loaded into a state police vehicle with a portable heater. Nobody complained loudly. The man with the broken nose complained quietly, which was his right. Sloane came out of the house at 12:41, satellite communicator in hand, having spent the previous 27 minutes on a call that Ethan had not listened to, but that had involved, based on the portions he'd caught through the kitchen window, a significant amount of clipped, precise instruction delivery, and at least one moment where her voice had gone very quiet in the particular way that voices go quiet when the emotion underneath them is being consciously compressed. She walked to Agent Torres, introduced herself, and began talking at a pace that left Torres taking notes as fast as he could manage. Ethan watched from the porch. He was tired in the specific way of post-adrenaline, the way where everything has a slightly muffled quality and your joints have filed complaints and the cut on your chin, which you'd been correct in assessing as mostly stopped, has decided to start again at a minor level. He pressed the back of his hand against it and looked out at his driveway, which currently contained 3 federal vehicles, 2 state police cruisers, and a collection of people who would all be gone by morning. Mia appeared beside him. She'd been at the kitchen window for the past 30 minutes and had, at some point, put her coat on over her pajamas in the purposeful way of a child who had decided to be officially outside even if only on the porch. "Did the bad guys get arrested?" she asked. "They're being arrested right now, yes." She watched the activity in the driveway with genuine interest. "How many were there?" "8? You got all 8? With help from the terrain and the lighting system." She nodded slowly, with the air of a structural engineer approving a design choice. "The floodlights were your idea?" "I installed them, yes." "I thought they were for the coyotes." "They're for whatever needs them," he said. She leaned against his arm in the way she'd been doing since she was small enough that leaning against his arm meant leaning against his knee. Not a demand for attention, just contact, the simple physical verification of his presence. He put his hand on top of her head. They watched the federal agents do their work. Around 1:30 in the morning, Sloane walked back from the cluster of vehicles to the porch. She had the tablet under her arm and the communicator in her hand and the look of a woman who had just finished something large and was existing in the first seconds of not having to hold it up anymore. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Torres wants a full debrief at the Denver field office tomorrow," she said. "Both of us, if you're willing." "I'll be there." She nodded, looked at Mia. She fell asleep standing up. He looked down. Mia's eyes were closed, her head against his arm. Her weight settled into him in the boneless way of children who have simply decided that sleep is happening now and the current position is adequate. "She does that," he said. "That's a talent." "It's a gift." He shifted so he could pick her up without waking her, or without fully waking her, since she made a small protesting sound and then immediately resettled against his shoulder. He looked at Sloane. "You should sleep too. There's a guest room." "I know. Mia showed me. Stiff sheets." "The sheets are—" "I know. I'm joking." A pause. "I think I'm joking. I'm not sure I've slept enough recently to be certain." He looked at her for a moment, standing on his porch in the January dark with federal agents behind her and a satellite communicator she'd used to transmit $40 million worth of financial crimes evidence, wearing a borrowed coat over her business clothes, with a laceration above her eyebrow, and a splinted wrist, and the specific kind of exhaustion that lives in the eyes and doesn't go away after a single night of sleep. "Come inside," he said. She came inside. He got Mia into bed without fully waking her, which was a skill that had taken approximately 2 years to develop and still wasn't reliable, but tonight it worked. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment in the dark, one hand on her back, feeling the small rise and fall of her breathing. 7 years old, and she'd spent an hour in a concrete shelter asking a stranger about horses. He sat there longer than he needed to, just doing that. Then he went back downstairs. Sloane was at the kitchen table with the tablet, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at the window, the dark square of it, and the faint reflection of the kitchen behind the glass. She'd taken off the borrowed coat and folded it over the back of the chair in the neat, automatic way of a person who folds things even when they're exhausted. "The investigators," she said when she heard him come in. "They told me something on the call about the deputy director Victor had in his pocket. He'd already been flagged 3 weeks ago." She turned from the window. "They were ahead of it. They just needed the full financial package to move on him, and they needed to know I was credible, that I wasn't manufacturing evidence to remove a COO I decided to get rid of. And now they know. And now they know." She looked at her hands. "There are employees in that evidence package, junior staff who had no idea what they were processing. Victor told you about them." "He did." "Did you believe him?" Ethan sat down across from her. "I believe that he told me because he thought it might change something. Whether it's true—" He paused. "Yes, I believe it's true. Men who are genuinely calculating don't complicate their remaining options with fiction. He told me because it was true and because he's going to need someone to confirm it later." She looked at him for a long moment. "You read people well." "I've had practice." "It's more than practice." She said it without flattery, just as an observation, the way she made most of her statements, direct, without the social softening that most people reach for. "You noticed everything from the beginning, the tire tracks, the device on the undercarriage, the incident report timing, the way I looked at the windows." She paused. "Most people don't notice those things. Most people don't need to. You do it automatically." "Apparently," he said, "whether I want to or not." She heard the weight in that and didn't push past it. The house was quiet in the way it gets after large things have happened. A particular quality of quiet, full rather than empty, the silence of a space that has been through something and is settling back into itself. "Your company," he said. "What happens now?" She exhaled slowly. "The contracts are secure. The financial crimes were contained within one division of one contract, which means the government's relationship with the company itself isn't compromised. That's the critical thing." She pressed the fingers of her good hand to the bridge of her nose briefly, a gesture of someone managing a headache they've been ignoring. "I'll need to rebuild the entire COO function, the audit and financial oversight structure. I'll need to spend the next 6 months explaining to the board, to federal contracting officers, to everyone who matters, exactly what happened and why it won't happen again. And the internal security breach, the ghost process. That's actually the most important thing to fix and the most complicated. Someone, Victor or someone working for Victor, was inside my personal executive account for at least 8 weeks. Every communication, every schedule item, every decision I thought I was making privately." She looked at the tablet. "I've been building something for 5 years that I was proud of. I am still proud of it. But pride is a useful thing until it becomes the reason you don't see something you should have seen." He thought about what to say to that. "You saw it," he said, "eventually, and then you moved on it, after $40 million. After finding the thread. You pulled it when you found it." He paused. "That's what matters. Not finding it the day before." She looked at him. "That's a generous interpretation." "It's accurate," he said. "Generous and accurate aren't mutually exclusive." She was quiet for a moment. "Your former unit," she said. "The teams. Was it hard to leave?" The question wasn't entirely unexpected. She'd been circling the edges of his history all day, not intrusively, just the way observant people accumulate information, but the directness of it was more than he'd anticipated. He thought about how to answer it honestly. "It was hard to leave," he said, "and it was the right thing to do. Both of those are true, and they don't cancel each other out. My wife was sick. We didn't know yet how sick, but she was sick and Mia was 3, and the math on being deployed at that point was one I couldn't make work." He paused. "And then Sarah died, and the math changed again. Different numbers, same answer. You stayed for Mia." "I stayed because Mia is the thing I'm here for. That's not a sacrifice. It's just—" He looked for the word. "It's just where the weight is. The things that weigh the most are the things you organize everything else around." Sloane looked at him with the particular expression she'd had a few times across the day. Not quite readable, not closed off either, something between those two things. The expression of a person who is doing internal work that they're not ready to name out loud. "When I was 26, she said carefully, I decided that the company was what I was building. That was the decision. Not explicitly. I didn't sit down and write it out, but that's the decision that got made. And I'm good at what I do. I'm genuinely good at it, and I don't say that. I know, he said. It's not arrogance. You're accurate. But last night, at 4 in the morning, at the bottom of a ravine in a wrecked car, she stopped. Started again. I was thinking about who was going to know that it had happened, who was going to... She shook her head slightly. It's a strange thought to be having, and I don't know what to do with it. He didn't try to answer it for her. He sat with it in the room, which was, he'd found, usually the more useful thing. Outside, the federal vehicles had started their departure. He could see headlights moving on the access road through the kitchen window, the sweep of them across the ceiling of the living room. Hale was in one of those vehicles, the list of names he'd made presumably in his pocket, heading toward a process that would take years and produce, eventually, an outcome that was as close to correct as these processes ever got. I should sleep, Sloane said. She stood, picked up the folded coat, set it back down without putting it on. Thank you for... She stopped. For all of it. The hill and the blanket and the eggs and the... She stopped again. All of it. You're welcome, he said. She went to the doorway. Sloane. She turned. The investigator, Reeves. When she said you did the right thing, she meant the part where you kept going when it was difficult, not just the part where you found it. She looked at him for a moment. Good night, Ethan, she said. Good night. He listened to her footsteps on the stairs, careful, slower than they'd been, the gait of someone allowing themselves to be tired now that tired was permitted. The guest room door, the soft click of the latch. The house settled around him. He stayed at the kitchen table for a while, the way he sometimes did at the end of things. Not processing exactly, not deciding, just sitting. His mug was empty. The wood stove had burned down to coals. The cut on his chin had dried and stopped complaining. Outside, the snow had stopped, finally, and through the window he could see the first pale suggestion of the color that happens before dawn starts. He hadn't slept in 26 hours. He got up, stoked the stove, rinsed the mugs, turned off the kitchen light. He stood in the dark for a moment. Then he went upstairs and checked on Mia, still deep under the blankets, one arm around the rabbit, and went to his own room and sat on the edge of the bed and pulled his boots off and lay back without taking anything else off. Because the kind of tired he was didn't have any steps in it. It just had the bed and the ceiling and the specific silence of a house where everyone inside it was, for the moment, safe. He was asleep before the thought finished forming. Outside, the clouds broke apart, and the stars came out over the Colorado mountains, cold and brilliant, and completely indifferent to everything that had happened beneath them, which was, in Ethan Calder's experience, exactly the right attitude for stars to have. The driveway was empty. The shelter panel was closed and latched. Ruthie moved in the barn, a slow settling sound, and then went still. Morning was coming. He woke up at 7:14, which was late for him. The light coming through the curtains had the particular quality of post-storm light, thin and very clear, the way sunlight looks when the atmosphere has been scoured clean by hours of moving cold. He lay there for a moment with the ceiling above him and the sounds of the house filtering through the walls, the wood stove working in the front room below, the creak of the old structure adjusting to the morning temperature, and from somewhere down the hall, the muffled one-sided sound of Mia talking to someone. I was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to get up, which was habit, and he was in the hallway in 14 seconds, which was something between habit and the residue of last night. He stopped outside Mia's door, and sometimes he burns the toast and then says it's supposed to be like that, which it isn't, Mia was saying. You can tell when toast is burned on purpose versus by accident. Burned on purpose has butter already on it to hide it. A pause. Then Sloane's voice, the dry quality in it that Ethan had been hearing at irregular intervals across the past 20 hours. He hides it with butter. Every time. Does it work? Not really. But I eat it anyway because he looks like he's trying. Ethan stood in the hallway outside his daughter's door and did not move for a moment. Your dad, Sloane said carefully, tries hard. At everything, Mia agreed. Except fabric softener. He doesn't try at that. He went downstairs. He made coffee, he made eggs, he burned the first batch of toast, genuinely, not on purpose, because his mind was somewhere else, and started a second batch that came out correctly. He put everything on the table and called upstairs, and listened to the sound of 2 sets of feet coming down, one small and fast and the other measured. and he stood at the stove with his back to the room and gave himself the 10 seconds that required. They ate breakfast. The three of them at the kitchen table with morning light coming through the window. The snow outside clean and undisturbed except for the tire tracks on the access road that had already started to fill in at the edges. Mia ate with the focused efficiency of a person who had been awake since 6 and was operating on a significant energy deficit. Sloane ate slowly, looking out the window between bites, occasionally at the tablet propped against the fruit bowl, occasionally at nothing in particular. Her wrist was better. The swelling had come down overnight, and though the splint stayed on, she'd stopped holding it with the careful attention of someone managing active pain and had started ignoring it the way you ignore something that hurts at a manageable level. The laceration above her eyebrow had closed cleanly. She looked like someone who had slept hard and woken into a situation that was simultaneously resolved and not resolved, the way most situations are in the morning after, the emergency over, the ordinary not yet resumed, the space between them strange and unfamiliar. "Torres called," she said between bites. "The Denver debrief is at 2 o'clock. He's sending a vehicle." "I'll drive myself." She looked at him. "It's a federal interview." "I know what it is. I'll drive myself." "The roads might still be—" "The roads are fine," he said. "I checked at 6:30. County plows came through around 5. She looked at him with the expression she used when she was deciding whether to push something and had decided not to. He'd come to recognize it in the past 20 hours as a specifically useful expression of hers, the one that meant she understood the shape of someone else's preferences and was choosing to respect them even when her own preferences ran different. "Okay," she said. Mia looked between them with the alert, interested expression of a child tracking a conversation that was mostly not about toast. "Are you going to come back?" she asked Sloane. Sloane set her fork down. It was the directness that Mia brought to everything. No social scaffolding, no softening, just the question, sitting in the middle of the table between the eggs and the too much butter. "I don't know yet," Sloane said, and she said it honestly, which was the right thing, and Mia accepted it the way she accepted honest things, with a small nod and the look of someone filing information for future reference. "You could," Mia said. "There's room." "Mia," Ethan said, "I'm just saying there's room." "I know what you're saying." Mia looked at her eggs. Then, with the air of someone who has made their position clear and is satisfied to leave it there, she resumed eating. The drive to Denver took 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was longer than usual because the highway had sections of packed snow that required patience, and Ethan had learned patience, though not effortlessly, from a combination of military training and the daily experience of raising Mia, which had its own curriculum on the subject. He drove alone, which he'd wanted, because he needed the time in the truck with nothing but the road and the mountains to do the internal accounting that the previous 24 hours had generated. He was not, by nature or by training, a man who spent extended time examining his own interior landscape. He'd been in enough situations where the examination would have been paralyzing to have developed a productive relationship with operating first and processing later. But later had arrived, and the truck cab was the right place for it, contained, moving, no obligation to perform anything for anyone. He thought about the tire tracks. The moment on the ridge road where he'd seen them disappear, and had known, in the animal way of knowing, that there was something wrong, and that he was the only person in a position to do anything about it. He hadn't thought about it then. He'd just gone. He'd spent 7 years building a life specifically designed around not going, around staying, around the principle that his most important job was here, on this land, with this child, and that the man who went to difficult places for difficult reasons was a chapter that had closed at the appropriate time. That was still true. And yet, he'd gone over that embankment in the dark and 11-degree weather, hand over hand on a rope tied to his trailer hitch, and he hadn't hesitated. And he'd done what he'd done last night on the property, in the snow and cold, with the efficiency and calm of someone performing a familiar task. And he hadn't hesitated about that either. And the honest thing, the thing the truck cab was for, was that he didn't regret it, and he wasn't confused about why. He'd been telling himself a story for 7 years. The story was that part of me is finished, the part that moves toward difficulty instead of away from it, the part that sees something wrong and considers the personal cost a secondary variable. That part served its purpose, and it's done. But the story was incomplete, which was different from being wrong. It wasn't that he was still a SEAL. He wasn't. He was a rancher and a father and a man who drove a truck with a bad reputation for muffler noise. And that was the truth of his daily life, and he had no quarrel with it. But the instinct didn't go away. It had just been waiting for something that required it, and when something had, it was there, exactly as it had always been, patient and immediate and completely uninterested in his narrative about having retired it. That was worth knowing. The mountains came down on both sides as the highway descended toward the Denver Basin, and the light hit them at the angle that makes Colorado mountains look like something painted rather than real, too dramatic to be entirely credible. And Ethan drove through them and thought about Sloane Whitaker saying, "I was thinking about who was going to know," and understood, in the way you understand things that happen in the chest rather than the head, exactly what she'd meant. The debrief lasted 4 hours. It was thorough and humorless, and conducted by people who were very good at their jobs, which Ethan appreciated because it meant the questions were specific, and the purpose behind each one was clear. He answered everything directly, held nothing back, and had the experience, familiar from a different context, of watching federal machinery engage with a problem and recognize the shape of it. Dana Reeves was there. She was smaller than her voice had suggested, compact and precise, with reading glasses she kept taking off and putting back on, and the habit of writing things down by hand on a legal pad even though a recorder was running. She thanked him at the end of the session, not effusively, just with the specific and genuine acknowledgement of someone who understood the exact value of what he'd done and didn't need to inflate it. "What happens to the junior employees?" he asked. "The ones Hale mentioned." Reeves looked at him for a moment. "He gave us 4 names. We've already spoken to 2 of them. The transactions were processed under falsified authorization documents. They had no knowledge of the underlying scheme." She paused. "They won't be charged. And the subcontractor? Same situation, same outcome." She looked at her legal pad. "For what it's worth, Mr. Calder, Hale's cooperation on that point, volunteering those names, is being noted. It doesn't change his situation materially, but it's noted." Ethan nodded. "One other thing," Reeves said as he was standing to leave. "The device on the undercarriage of Miss Whitaker's vehicle. We recovered it. It was dual function, tracking and remote brake system interference. They didn't just follow her and push her off. They also interfered with her ability to correct." He looked at her. "She had almost no chance," Reeves said. "From the moment they initiated, on that curve, at that speed, almost none." A pause. "You should know that." He thought about the bend in the tire tracks, the gap in the guardrail, the 40-foot drop in the dark. "Thank you," he said. He drove home. 6 months is a strange unit of time. It's long enough to establish new patterns, and short enough that the old ones are still visible underneath, like furniture outlines on a carpet after you've rearranged the room. Things change in 6 months, but they change the way land changes, gradually. And then you look up one day and the shape of the horizon is different from what it used to be. Victor Hale pleaded not guilty at his arraignment and guilty at his trial. 11 weeks later, after 3 of his co-conspirators had reached plea agreements that made the evidentiary picture sufficiently clear that his attorneys advised a different strategy, he received 14 years in a federal facility. The deputy director who had been in his pocket received 7, which Ethan thought was too light and understood was what the system had produced, and those were 2 different things that didn't need to be reconciled. The other members of the conspiracy were sorted out over the following months, each according to their specific degree of participation. The junior employees and subcontractor cleared with the speed of cases that have the right outcome and the right evidence. Sloane had hired private attorneys for all 4 of them, not announced, not made into a statement about her character or her company's culture, just done. He found out about it from Mia, who had found out about it in the way Mia found out about things she wasn't supposed to know, which was by being quiet and present and completely underestimated. Whitaker Integrated Systems did not collapse. This surprised some people who had predicted that a federal conspiracy embedded in one of its major contracts would be fatal to the company's government relationships. Sloane had apparently anticipated this prediction and had spent the 6 months following the arrest doing what she did when she decided something needed to be done, methodically and without drama, and with the specific competence that had built the company in the first place. She restructured the oversight division, brought in an independent auditing firm with no prior relationship to the company, and testified before a Senate subcommittee with the kind of direct clarity that left the subcommittee's chairman saying, on record, that her testimony was among the most useful he'd heard in 12 years in that seat. Ethan read about that last part in the Denver Post, which he got delivered on Saturdays because Mia liked the comics section, even though she'd never admit it was the reason she liked Saturdays. Sloane came back to Pine Haven 2 weeks after the Denver debrief. She said it was to check on the wrist, which had been properly set by an orthopedist in Denver, and put in a real cast, and to drop off a bottle of whiskey that was significantly more expensive than anything Ethan kept in the house, and to see how Mia was doing. He didn't point out that checking on the wrist didn't require a 3-hour drive. He poured the whiskey and they sat on the porch in coats, because it was still February, and talked for 2 hours about nothing that was urgent. About the company. About Mia's most recent school project, which was about mountain ecosystems, and which had involved Ethan helping her build a diorama that he suspected he'd done too much of. About Ruthie, who had achieved a new character distinction by attempting to bite a fence post and winning absolutely nothing from the experience. She came back the following weekend, and the one after that. By April, she'd stopped explaining why she was coming, and had started calling on Thursday nights to ask if Saturday worked. And Ethan had started making sure Saturday worked. And Mia had started referring to Sloane's visits as a category of event rather than individual occurrences. When Sloane comes this weekend, rather than if Sloane comes. And Ethan let that shift in tense go unremarked, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. It wasn't uncomplicated. He wanted to be honest about that, at least with himself, because complications existed and pretending they didn't was how people created different and larger complications. Sloane ran a company that operated in Denver and Washington and 3 international offices. She worked the hours that building and defending something large requires, which were not small hours. She carried the specific residue of someone who had organized her life around achievement for long enough that the habit of achievement had become load-bearing. Remove it, and you didn't know yet what held up what. She was not a woman who settled easily into someone else's established world, and his world was established deeply and deliberately around 40 acres and a 7-year-old in the rhythms of a life that moved at the pace of seasons and livestock and school schedules. These were real things. They didn't make the other things less real. He'd learned, at some point in the years since Sarah died, that life doesn't offer you the version of things you'd have designed from scratch. It offers you the version that shows up, and you can refuse it because it doesn't match the design. Or you can look at what it actually is and make an honest decision about that. Mia's school schedule is not negotiable. If there's travel, it fits around that or it doesn't happen. Understood. And I need the authority to build it the right way, not inherit someone else's structure and patch it. Build it. That's the job I'm offering, she said. Not patchwork. Build. He looked at her for a moment. One more condition, he said. What? The pancakes. You keep trying. That's not negotiable either. She looked at him, then she laughed. Not a polished laugh. Not the professional laugh he imagined she deployed in boardrooms, but an actual one, abrupt and unguarded. The laugh of someone who has been caught off guard by a small and genuine thing. That's your condition, she said. It matters to Mia. It does not matter to Mia. She told me it matters to her. She told you that specifically? She told me, and I quote, that Sloane's pancakes taste like the diorama looks, and that she hopes Sloane keeps trying because it's funny to watch. Sloane stared at him. She's 7, he said. She has opinions. That child, Sloane said, with the specific expression she used when Mia had done something that was simultaneously infuriating and deeply endearing, is going to be someone's problem someday. She's my problem, Ethan said. I'm keeping her. The kitchen was quiet for a moment, and then Sloane said, Okay, deal. And they shook hands across the table like it was a transaction, which it was and also wasn't, and both of them understood both of those things. Yeah. The following January, a year, nearly exactly, from the night on the Ridge Road, Sloane suggested the drive. She said it the way she said things she'd thought about carefully, but wanted to seem casual, with a certain deliberate lightness that he'd come to recognize as the tell, the slight overcorrection that appeared when she'd already committed internally to something and was offering it to him to see what he did with it. I thought we could drive up to the ridge, she said, the 3 of us, just to... She stopped. I don't know. I've been thinking about it. Okay, he said. You don't want to know why. I know why, he said. She looked at him. Because it's where it started, he said. And you want to see it as a place now instead of a thing that happened. She held his gaze. Yes, she said. That's exactly why. They went on a Saturday in late January, which was cold but clear, the kind of Colorado winter day that looks like something from a photograph. The sky a hard, clean blue. The snow on the mountains absolute and brilliant. Mia sat in the back seat of the truck and provided continuous commentary on the landscape, the road conditions, a hawk she spotted on a fence post that she insisted was significant, though she couldn't articulate in what way, and a proposed revision to the diorama that she had been thinking about and which she felt warranted a group discussion. Ethan drove. Sloane sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap, not looking at her phone, not looking at the tablet she'd brought, and then left on the kitchen counter at the last second. She looked out the window at the mountains. He didn't try to fill the silence. When he pulled up to the stretch of Ridge Road and stopped the truck, the three of them sat for a moment without getting out. The guardrail had been repaired. New sections where the old ones had been, bright metal against the old galvanized gray. Below the embankment, through the bare branches of the winter pines, you could see the pale shape of the slope where the Mercedes had come to rest against the trees. The trees were still there. The car wasn't. Sloane got out first. She walked to the guardrail and stood there with her coat pulled tight against the wind coming off the peak to the north, looking down. He got out and stood a few feet behind her, giving her the space the moment required. Mia, who had read the situation with the accuracy she brought to situations she'd decided to take seriously, stayed by the truck and crouched down to examine something in the snow that had apparently captured her scientific attention. Sloane stood at the guardrail for a while. He didn't know exactly what she was thinking. He wasn't meant to, and the impulse to know, to manage, to fill, to help, was one he'd been learning to sit with rather than act on, because some things needed to be witnessed and not fixed, and the difference mattered. But he could see the line of her shoulders. He'd spent enough time watching the way this particular person held herself, in meetings and on porches and at his kitchen table and in the passenger seat of the truck, to read the small physical language of her, the way her shoulders sat when she was containing something versus when she was at rest. And right now, at this guardrail, looking down at the slope where she'd nearly died, her shoulders were doing the slow, almost invisible work of letting something go. After a while, she turned. I remember thinking the car was going to keep going, she said, after it hit the trees. I remember thinking it wasn't going to stop. It almost didn't, he said. The trees were barely big enough. They were big enough. She looked at him for a moment. The wind came and moved her hair across her face, and she pushed it back impatiently. The gesture that was so specifically hers that he had the disorienting experience of recognizing it, the way you recognize something that has become a part of your ordinary. Not noted because it's remarkable, but suddenly remarkable because you realize how ordinary it's become. I thought I was going to die alone, she said. That was the actual thought. Not I'm going to die, but I'm going to die alone and nobody's going to know for hours. She paused. I don't know if that makes me pathetic or just honest. Honest, he said. You don't know that. I do know that, he said, because it's true. The circumstance was what you were afraid of. Not the dying. You were afraid you'd built something that the ledger was going to close with the company on one side and nothing else. He stopped. That's not pathetic. That's just a thing you recognized about yourself in an extreme moment. Most people don't get that far. She looked at the mountain behind him. It wasn't nothing else, she said quietly. Even then, I want to be accurate about that. I know. I just hadn't. She stopped, started again. I hadn't let it be what it was. He waited. I'm letting it, she said. Now, for what that's worth. He looked at her, standing on a mountain road in January with a new guardrail behind her and a clear sky above her. And his daughter crouched 30 feet away examining something in the snow with complete scientific dedication, and he thought about the story he'd been telling himself for 7 years. That part of me is finished, that version of going toward things is done, and understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes in the cold, clean air after a storm, that the story had never been about the going. It had been about having something worth coming back to. That was the thing he'd been building all those years. Not a life without the hard parts. Not a life that didn't require him to know how to carry weight or move through darkness or hold steady when the pressure came. But a life that the hard parts led back to. a fixed point. A door with a wood stove behind it, and eggs on the stove, and a 7-year-old who would eat burned toast without complaint because she understood, at some deep and wordless level, what trying looked like. You couldn't design that from scratch. You could only recognize it when it showed up and decide. "Dad," Mia called. He looked over. She was still crouched in the snow, but she'd found something. A small pine cone, by the look of it, perfectly formed, the kind that makes children and people who've retained the child's instinct stop and pick it up because it is exactly what it should be. "Look," she said, holding it up. "Good find," he said. She turned it in her fingers, satisfied, and put it in her pocket with the seriousness of someone adding to a collection of things that matter for reasons that don't need to be explained. Sloane had turned to watch this. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. He held out his hand. She took it, which was not the first time, but was the first time on this road, at this guardrail, with this sky above them, and it felt like a specific thing. Not a beginning, exactly, because it wasn't the beginning. The beginning had been 12 months ago in the dark and the cold and the rope tied to his trailer hitch. But a point in the middle where you look up from the work and see how far you've come and decide, deliberately and with full knowledge of the cost, to keep going. Mia came toward them across the snow, the pine cone in her pocket, her boots leaving perfect prints in the white field of the roadside. She looked at their joined hands with the unsurprised expression of a child who had been waiting for the adults to catch up. "Can we get food on the way back?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan said. "Real food, not toast." "Real food." "Sloane can't cook," Mia said, informatively, to the mountains. "I'm working on it," Sloane said. "The pancakes are getting better," Mia said, with the careful generosity of a diplomat. "They're still mostly terrible, but less terrible than before." "Thank you, Mia." "You're welcome." They walked back to the truck, the three of them, in the specific configuration they'd arrived at not through planning, but through the ordinary accumulation of Saturdays and kitchen tables and burnt toast, and Ruthie's opinions and a pine cone in a coat pocket. The mountain road was empty in both directions. The sky was the hard, clean blue of a winter that had said what it had to say and was now just weather, ordinary and indifferent and entirely safe. Ethan got behind the wheel. Mia climbed in the back. Sloane got in the passenger seat. He drove. There are people who spend their lives waiting for certainty before they move, waiting to know how it turns out, how it ends, what the cost will be, whether the ledger closes the right way. He understood that impulse. He'd felt it himself. In the years after Sarah, when every decision felt like it required a level of certainty he didn't have access to. But certainty is not how it works. You see the tire tracks disappear off the edge of the road. You stop the truck. You look. And then you go over the edge with a rope tied to a trailer hitch, and your hands cold, and the dark total, and no guarantee of anything except that you're the only person in a position to go. And sometimes what you find at the bottom is more than you went looking for. Sometimes the thing that was broken is the thing that leads you, finally, to what holds. The truck came off the ridge and onto the main road, and the mountains opened up on all sides, enormous and permanent and completely uninterested in anyone's plans for them, and the heater worked for once without needing 10 minutes to decide. And Mia asked approximately 4 questions in the first mile about what constituted real food, and Sloane answered 2 of them in the patient and slightly baffled way of a person who had negotiated billion-dollar contracts and still found the logic of a 7-year-old genuinely surprising. Ethan drove through the Colorado mountains. His hands were steady on the wheel. They always had been. That wasn't going to change.